On the night of November 25th, 1943, 5 American destroyers moved through the Black Water off Cape St. George. Their commander had been in charge for exactly 33 days. In the next 3 hours, he sank 3 Japanese destroyers, killed 647 enemy sailors, suffered 0 casualties, and walked away before a single enemy aircraft found him. Samuel Eliot Morison would later call it an almost perfect action. Halsey called it the Trafalgar of the Pacific. The United States Naval War College would teach the battle for decades as the model of destroyer warfare. The commander's name was Arleigh Albert Burke. And today, if you ask the average American sailor who Arleigh Burke was, the answer comes back the same way every time. He is a ship. He is a hull class. He is a destroyer designation, DDG-51, the backbone of the modern United States fleet. 74 ships carry his name. 25 more are on order. Not one of them carries his story. Welcome to Flagship Command WW2, where command, ego, and the sea collide, and every flag officer's story ends with a verdict history already delivered. The men who name Navy ships after admirals do not do it to preserve the admiral's memory. They do it to bury him. A hull class absorbs a name the way the ocean absorbs a body. The letters stay on the bow. The man disappears into the steel. Over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you what Arleigh Burke actually did in 4 months of combat in the Upper Solomons, how he wrote the doctrine that broke Japanese night supremacy, why he was unprecedentedly chosen as Chief of Naval Operations over 92 more senior admirals, what he fought for in 6 years in that chair, and why the Navy needed to remember him as a ship instead of a man. But first, you need to understand what the United States Navy looked like in 1943. The Pacific War, the public remembers, runs through aircraft carriers. Midway, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, Leyte Gulf. Those are the battles in the history books. Those are the battles in the movies. Those are the battles that made the reputations of Nimitz, Spruance, Halsey, and Mitcher. There is another war inside that war, a smaller one, a darker one, fought at night at close range by ships that displaced 2,100 tons and had no business surviving contact with anything larger than themselves. The Americans called these ships destroyers. In the first year of the Pacific War, they got destroyed. The Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, was the worst defeat in the history of American naval warfare. 4 heavy cruisers sunk in 20 minutes. The Battle of Tassafaronga on November 30, 1942, was worse in a different way. An American force with radar, numerical superiority, and surprise lost 1 cruiser sunk, and 3 more crippled to a Japanese destroyer force that was trying to deliver rice in barrels. The Japanese had a torpedo the Americans did not know existed. They called it the Type 93. The Americans would later name it the Long Lance. It ran at 49 knots, carried a 1,000-pound warhead, and reached out 22,000 yards with no wake to warn you it was coming. The United States Navy went into 1943 convinced that its surface fleet could not win a night action against Japanese destroyers. The doctrine said destroyers screen cruisers. The doctrine said cruisers fire first. The doctrine said stay in formation. The doctrine was getting American sailors killed. This is the world Arleigh Burke walked into. He was 41 years old. He had grown up on a farm outside Boulder, Colorado, the grandson of a Swedish immigrant named Björkegren, who had anglicized the family name at Ellis Island. He had graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1923, near the bottom of his class academically, and he had spent most of his career in ordnance. When the war began, he was an ordnance inspector at the Naval Gun Factory in Washington, a shore billet he despised. He wrote letter after letter begging for sea duty. The letters were ignored. When he finally got to the South Pacific in early 1943, he was a 41-year-old commander with no combat experience and a reputation as a difficult subordinate. He did what the doctrine told him not to do. He studied. He studied the Japanese. He studied the radar. He studied the torpedo. He studied every after-action report he could pull from the Combat Intelligence Center at Noumea. He sat in the wardroom of every destroyer he boarded and asked the young officers, the ones who had actually been in the night fights, what was happening that the reports were not capturing. He collected the pattern the Navy bureaucracy was missing. The pattern was this: the Americans had better radar. The Japanese had better torpedoes. The Americans kept opening with gunfire, which gave away their position, which let the Japanese torpedoes find them in the dark. The Americans kept screening their cruisers, which put their most aggressive weapon, the destroyer, behind the least aggressive one, the cruiser. The Americans kept waiting for orders from the task force commander, who was usually on the cruiser, which meant by the time the destroyers were free to attack the Japanese, had already fired and turned away. Every structural assumption of American surface doctrine was wrong. Burke wrote a different doctrine, 5 principles. Destroyers cut loose from cruiser screens and attack on their own initiative. Radar detects the enemy beyond visual range. The force closes silently. Torpedoes fire first at 5 to 7,000 yards, then the force turns 90 degrees away at full speed before the Japanese see a muzzle flash. Guns open only after the torpedoes have hit, so the shooting starts on a target that is already dying. And every ship's captain is briefed on the commander's intent before the force leaves port, so that when the radar pings, no one has to wait for orders. His standing order to his captains was written in one sentence: destroyers to attack on enemy contact without orders from the task force commander. That single sentence was heresy in the United States Navy of 1943. On October 23, 1943, Burke took command of Destroyer Squadron 23 at Espiritu Santo. He broke his pennant in USS Charles Osborne, 8 Fletcher-class destroyers, divided into 2 divisions of 4. His own destroyer division, 45, Osborne, Claxton, Dyson, and Stanley. Bernard Austin's destroyer division, 46, Converse, Foote, Spence, and Thatcher. 2 days later, inspecting the torpedo tubes aboard USS Claxton, Burke saw a painting. One of the torpedo men, a young sailor named Bowler, had painted the cartoon character Little Beaver, the Native American sidekick from the Red Ryder comic strip, onto the mount. The crews had been joking they were busy as beavers given the operational tempo in the Solomons. Burke looked at the painting and decided those were his little beavers. From that day forward, Destroyer Squadron 23 flew that insignia. His intelligence officer, incidentally, was a young lieutenant named Byron White. After the war, Byron White would sit on the Supreme Court of the United States for 31 years. 8 days later, on November 2, 1943, the Little Beavers went into their first fight under Burke, the Battle of Empress, Augusta Bay. An American force under Rear Admiral Aaron Tip Merrill was protecting the Bougainville landings. Vice Admiral Sentaro Omori came down from Rabaul with 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 6 destroyers, ordered to smash the beachhead. American radar picked Omori up at 36,000 yards at 2:27 in the morning. At 2:31, Burke did something no American destroyer squadron had ever been authorized to do in the Solomons. He broke away from the cruiser screen and attacked the Japanese northern flank on his own initiative. At 2:46, from 5,500 yards, Burke's 4 destroyers fired 25 torpedoes and immediately turned 90 degrees south to evade. The torpedoes missed, defeated by Japanese maneuvering, but the principle had been tested in combat. The destroyers had attacked first. The cruisers had followed. By dawn, the Japanese light cruiser Sendai was sunk, the destroyer Hatsukaze was sunk, and Omori was in full retreat back to Rabaul. The Americans lost 1 destroyer torpedoed in the stern, 19 men killed. 3 weeks later, Burke would get the action that belongs to history. On November 24, 1943, the squadron was running north from Purvis Bay. USS Spence reported a fouled boiler. Her number 4 boiler had accumulated heavy scale and could not deliver full steam pressure. The whole squadron, which was only as fast as its slowest ship, was limited to 31 knots against a Fletcher class rated at 34 plus. Burke signaled the limitation to Halsey's headquarters. Halsey's operations officer, Captain Harry Thurber, answered with a teasing dispatch addressed to, and this is verbatim from the message log, 31 knot Burke. The public got the nickname backwards. It was not a compliment about speed. It was gentle needling about slowness, the kind of thing a friend writes when he knows you're embarrassed to be late. But the dispatch was signed Halsey, because all of them were, and the reporters assumed Halsey himself had coined it, and the public assumed 31 knots meant fast. The nickname stuck. It followed Burke for the rest of his life. Decades later, when the legend took over, the popular version had Halsey asking Burke what he was doing in a Japanese minefield, and Burke replying, 31 knots. That version appears in paperback biographies. It is not supported by a single primary document. It is a story the culture built to make a simpler version of a more complicated man. The real dispatch from Halsey's headquarters to Burke on November 24, 1943, read as follows: 31 knot. Burke, get athwart the Buka-Rabaul evacuation line about 35 miles west of Buka. If no enemy contacts by 0300 on the 25th, come south to refuel same place. If enemy contacted, you know what to do. Here's the part the official history leaves out. Burke did know what to do. He had been waiting to do it for 20 months. The Japanese were running their last Tokyo Express of the campaign. Captain Kyoto Kagawa, commander of Destroyer Division 31, was bringing 5 destroyers down the slot. 3 of them, Amagiri, Yugiri, and Uzuki, were loaded with 920 army troops and evacuees from the bombed-out Buka airfield. The other 2, Onami as flagship and Makinami, were the screen. Kagawa was a 47-year-old line officer from Hiroshima. He had graduated 53rd in a class of 124 from the Imperial Naval Academy in 1918. He had commanded the destroyers Fubuki and Shinonome in the 1930s. He had been promoted to captain on October 15th, 1941, 7 weeks before Pearl Harbor. He was a cautious, careful destroyer man. the kind of officer who had made the Japanese destroyer force the most feared surface arm in the world. He would never see his 48th birthday. At 0141 on November the 25, 1943, the radar on USS Dyson painted Onami and Makanami at 22,000 yards. The overcast was low, the sea was dark. Burke would later describe the weather in a phrase his biographers have repeated 100 times, an ideal night for a nice, quiet torpedo attack. He closed. No lights, no signals, no gunfire. His 3 lead destroyers, Osborne, Claxton, and Dyson, drove into 5,500 yards in total silence. At 0156, Burke transmitted one sentence over the talk between ships' radio. "Hang on to your hats, boys. Here we go." 15 torpedoes went into the water in half salvos. The squadron immediately turned 90 degrees south at 30 knots. The Japanese never saw them coming. Onami, Kagawa's flagship, took multiple hits amidships. Her magazines exploded. She sank with all 228 men aboard, including Kagawa himself, who died at his command post without ever seeing the ships that killed him. Makanami took one torpedo and went dead in the water. About 200 of her 228 crew were lost. The screen was gone in 90 seconds. At 0215, Burke's radar picked up Yamashiro's 3 transport destroyers, Amagiri, Yugiri, and Uzuki, 13,000 yards ahead. Acting on what he later called a gut feeling, Burke ordered a sharp turn to starboard. Japanese long-lance torpedoes from Yugiri, aimed at the American column, exploded harmlessly in the empty wakes where the destroyers had been 30 seconds earlier. Burke opened fire at 0222, forward guns only, to maintain full speed. He ran down Yugiri for 40 minutes. By 0328, Yugiri was gone. Uzuki took one shell hit that failed to explode. She escaped. Amagiri escaped untouched, and here is a detail that belongs in the story. Amagiri was the same destroyer that, 4 months earlier on August 2, 1943, had rammed and cut in half patrol torpedo boat 109, under the command of a 26-year-old lieutenant named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. At 0404 in the morning, Burke broke off. He was low on fuel. He was low on ammunition. He knew Rabaul-based aircraft would come at dawn. The Little Beavers turned south and ran for Purvis Bay, where they arrived that Thanksgiving evening. Not one Japanese plane attacked. Not one torpedo found them on the retreat. The final tally: 3 Japanese destroyers sunk, 1 damaged. 647 Japanese sailors and soldiers killed. 1 torpedo struck USS Converse during the engagement, a dead center hit that should have blown her bow off. The torpedo was a dud. It failed to explode. 0 American ships lost, 0 damage, 0 casualties. Quick moment. If this is changing how you see naval history, a like genuinely helps. The algorithm notices. Now, back to Burke. Morison's phrase, written 15 years later, was an almost perfect action. Halsey called it the Trafalgar of the Pacific. Burke was awarded the Navy Cross. The Presidential Unit Citation, the only one awarded to an American destroyer squadron during the entire war, would credit Destroyer Squadron 23 with 9 Japanese destroyers, 1 submarine, several smaller craft, and approximately 30 aircraft across 22 separate engagements in 4 months of combat. That is the combat record. And here is the question the Navy does not want you to ask. Why do you know none of this? The answer has 3 layers, and the Navy built all 3 of them. The first layer is the carrier narrative. American popular memory of the Pacific War runs through aircraft carriers because aircraft carriers are photogenic. The Japanese surrender was signed on a battleship. The atomic bombs were dropped from bombers. The Midway Hollywood told us about was carriers killing carriers. There's no room in that story for the Solomons. There's no room for a 2,100-ton destroyer fighting at 40 knots in pitch blackness, using radar nobody in the public understood. Destroyer warfare is technical warfare. It rewards analysts, not screenwriters. Morison's assessment survived in Naval War College syllabi. It did not survive on the History Channel. The second layer is what I want you to focus on, because it is the mechanism I promised you at the beginning of this video. When the Navy names a class of warships after a living admiral, the name does not preserve the admiral's memory. It replaces it. The hull absorbs the man. After 1991, when USS Arleigh Burke DDG-51 was commissioned at Norfolk, with the 89-year-old Burke himself present on the pier, the sentence Arleigh Burke slowly stopped meaning a person and started meaning a ship type. 35 years later, active duty sailors use the phrase Burke class hundreds of times a week without any mental image of the man attached. The naming was an honor. The naming was also an erasure. Both things are true. The Navy chose to preserve him as a silhouette. The third layer is the one the Navy buried deepest, because after the combat record ends, there's another 6 years of Arleigh Burke's service that almost no American can tell you anything about. The 6 years when he was the 15th Chief of Naval Operations of the United States Navy. In 1955, Dwight Eisenhower and Secretary of the Navy Charles Thomas picked Arleigh Burke as Chief of Naval Operations. Burke was 53 years old. He had never served as a vice admiral. He was jumped from 2 stars to 4 stars, over 92 more senior admirals. The previous summer, Burke had written in a private letter that he doubted he could even make vice admiral, and he was not sure he would want the top job if offered. He got it anyway. He took the oath on August 17, 1955. He would hold the job, unprecedentedly, for 3 consecutive 2-year terms. That record of consecutive tenure has never been matched. What he did in those 6 years is the real story of how American naval power survived into the Cold War. And not one piece of it carries his name. Start with the most important program of his tenure, the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile. In 1955, the United States Navy had no ballistic missile program. The Army had Jupiter, a liquid-fueled rocket, and the Air Force had Atlas, bigger and further along, and both services wanted the Navy kept out of the strategic deterrence business entirely. Burke refused to accept that. On November 17, 1955, with Secretary Thomas, he created the Special Projects Office under Rear Admiral William Redd Reborn. The Special Projects Office was a bureaucratic time bomb. It reported directly to the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy. It bypassed every Navy bureau. It bypassed every normal chain of command. Burke gave Reborn what Navy historians now call the magic letter, a single page of authorization that let Reborn requisition resources from any command in the fleet. And here is the detail that matters for this story. Burke did not put Rickover in charge of Polaris. He kept Admiral Hyman Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy, out of the program deliberately. Rickover already controlled naval reactors, which had independent congressional backing from Carl Vinson and Mendel Rivers, and reported to Rickover as a personal fiefdom. Rickover wanted Polaris too. Burke told him no. He gave the job to Rayborn, a surface officer with no nuclear background, because Burke wanted a program that answered to the Navy, not to one admiral's empire. In 1956, at the Project Nobska summer study at Woods Hole, the physicist Edward Teller told Burke that a 1-megaton thermonuclear warhead could be built small enough to fit on a submarine-launched missile by 1963. Burke issued the formal requirement in February 1957. Then the Soviets launched Sputnik in October 1957, and Burke pulled the deadline forward by 3 years. The Navy launched USS George Washington, the first fleet ballistic missile submarine, on June 9, 1959. On July 20, 1960, George Washington fired 2 Polaris A-1 missiles from submerged position off Cape Canaveral. On November 15, 1960, she left on the first ballistic missile submarine, the USS Nautilus 60. She left on the first ballistic missile deterrent patrol in human history, 3 full years ahead of the original schedule. Herbert York, the first director of Defense Research and Engineering, called Polaris one of the really well-run programs in the Defense Department. John Lehman, who would himself become Secretary of the Navy under Reagan, wrote in memoir the single sentence that explains what Burke actually did. Quote, Burke and Eisenhower would protect the executive from any interference from Rickover, Navy bureaucracy, or meddling from Congress. Upon that structure, Polaris was completed under budget and ahead of schedule. End quote. Burke wanted 40 boats. The final fleet was 41 for freedom. That number, 41 for freedom, is the entire reason the United States still has a surviving nuclear deterrent today. The Air Force's land-based missiles can be counted from satellites. The bombers can be shot down. The only leg of the nuclear triad that has never been credibly targetable is the submarine leg. Burke built that. His reward for building it was that the Navy named 41 submarines in his program, and not one of them after him. The Rickover fight was bigger than Polaris. Rickover wanted nuclear propulsion on every major surface combatant in the fleet. Burke wanted a balanced fleet with nuclear power for capital ships and conventional propulsion for everything else, because nuclear surface ships cost 2 to 3 times what conventional ones cost, and Burke was trying to keep the Navy at a viable numerical strength during Eisenhower's defense budget cuts. Between 1953 and 1960, Eisenhower cut defense spending from 64% of the federal budget to 47%, and the Navy was ordered to cut 300 ships. The active fleet fell from 967 ships in 1957 to 812 ships in 1960. Burke fought every round of those cuts. During the Quemoy-Matsu crisis in 1958, when Communist China shelled the offshore islands and the Joint Chiefs debated a nuclear response, Burke told the room, quote, otherwise we faced the prospect of losing the whole world in 10 years. The argument that nothing is worth a world war was the reason why the Communists had been winning all along. End quote. 7 American aircraft carriers deployed at the peak of the crisis. The Chinese stopped. No nuclear weapons were used. In July 1958, Burke's 6th Fleet landed 14,000 Marines at Beirut in 36 hours. In October 1956, during the Suez Crisis, he had mobilized the Mediterranean Fleet to cover a potential American withdrawal of civilians. Every one of those deployments was a live proof that a balanced fleet could do things Rickover's all-nuclear vision could not afford. Burke won his policy battle in his own time. He lost it in the long run. Only 9 nuclear surface ships were ever built by the United States Navy. All of them were decommissioned by 1998. Rickover's empire survived. Burke's balance did not. In 1958, Congress passed the Defense Reorganization Act, which removed the service chiefs from the operational chain of command. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the civilian Secretary of Defense would now run the warfighting. The service chiefs became advisors. Burke fought the law. He lost. The naval historian David Allen Rosenberg wrote the definitive verdict on what happened. Arleigh Burke was, quote, the last chief of naval operations to actually command the fleets, end quote. Every admiral since has held a smaller office than Burke held. Then, in January 1961, John F. Kennedy came into office with Robert McNamara at the Defense Department. McNamara brought systems analysis. McNamara brought planning, programming, budgeting. McNamara brought 96 programmatic queries issued to the services on March 8, 1961. The analytical framework was not wrong. The framework was designed to strip operational judgment from uniformed officers and transfer it to civilian analysts with computers. Burke had been fighting that tendency since 1958. McNamara accelerated it. 3 months into the Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Burke had pushed the president to authorize American air cover for the Cuban Exile Brigade. Kennedy refused. The brigade was annihilated on the beach. On April 22, 1961, Kennedy appointed Burke to the Taylor Committee to investigate the failure, alongside Maxwell Taylor, Robert Kennedy, and Allen Dulles. The committee reported on June 13, 1961. On July 26th, Kennedy awarded Burke a Gold Star to his 3rd Distinguished Service Medal. 6 days later, Burke retired. August 1, 1961. 42 years of naval service ended. According to his biographer E.B. Potter, Kennedy offered him a 4th 2-year term as Chief of Naval Operations. Burke turned it down. He said the Navy needed younger leaders. Potter also records that Kennedy offered him the ambassadorship to Australia. He turned that down too. No contemporaneous primary document confirms either offer. Only Potter's account, drawn from interviews with Burke himself in the 1980s. Take it as Burke's memory, not as declassified cable traffic. What we know for certain is what Rosenberg wrote after Burke's death. Quote, when Arleigh Burke retired as Chief of Naval Operations in the summer of 1961, the most committed supporter of finite deterrence was out of government, end quote. The man who had run the destroyer doctrine revolution at Cape St. George, and who had broken the Polaris program loose from Rickover in Congress, and who had fought Eisenhower and McNamara for a balanced fleet, walked off the bridge of American naval power on a summer morning at the age of 59. He did not go quietly. He was pushed. He lived another 34 years. He co-founded the Center for Strategic and International Studies in 1962. He advised every president who would take his calls. He wrote articles. He testified. He watched the Navy he had shaped. On January 10, 1977, in one of the last acts of his presidency, Gerald Ford awarded Burke the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The citation read, quote, he made the sea a place of victory in war, a mighty fortress in peace, end quote. Note the date, not Reagan, not the first Bush, Gerald Ford, in 1977. The same year, a 37-year-old John Lehman first met Burke in person. 4 years later, Lehman became Secretary of the Navy under Ronald Reagan. Lehman had been Burke's protege. Lehman called Burke his sea daddy, which is Navy slang for the older officer who teaches you the job. In 1981, Lehman launched the Reagan 600-ship Navy, which needed a new generation of Aegis-equipped guided missile destroyers. And Lehman, with his Secretary of the Navy Authority, made the decision that this new destroyer class would be named after Arleigh Burke, who was then still alive at the age of 80. It was only the 4th time since 1861 that the United States Navy had named a warship class after a living person. At the early keel laying ceremony at Bath Iron Works in Maine in 1985, Burke himself chalked his initials onto a piece of steel plate that was later built into the lead ship. On September 16, 1989, USS Arleigh Burke was launched at Bath. Burke's wife Roberta, known to everyone as Bobby, broke the champagne bottle against the hull. 400 surviving Little Beaver veterans of Destroyer Squadron 23 came to watch. On July 4, 1991, Burke, now 89 years old, stood on the pier at Norfolk at the commissioning of USS Arleigh Burke, DDG-51. He gave the shortest speech of his life. It contained the sentence that is still engraved in the ship's mess deck. Quote, this ship is built to fight. You had better know how. End quote. 4 years and 6 months later, on January 1, 1996, Burke died at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda. He was 94. President Clinton spoke at the memorial at the United States Naval Academy Chapel. At Burke's own request, his headstone in the Naval Academy Cemetery carries exactly one word. It is not Admiral. It is not Chief of Naval Operations. It is not Commander of Destroyer Squadron 23. It is Sailor. Here's the part that finishes the story. On September 23, 2014, USS Arleigh Burke fired the first Tomahawk missiles of the American anti-Islamic State air campaign, launching from the Red Sea against targets in Syria. On the night of April 13 to 14, 2024, USS Arleigh Burke and USS Kearney together shot down at least 6 Iranian ballistic missiles during Iran's strike on Israel. The ship Burke, christened in 1991, is still fighting, still at sea, still doing exactly what her namesake would have recognized: independent, radar-cued, missile-led, at night, in distant waters. 74 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers are in active service. 25 more are authorized or on order. It is the longest production run of any United States surface combatant in the modern era. The ships carry Aegis radar systems with 90 vertical launch cells. They carry Tomahawk cruise missiles. They carry SM-3 interceptors for ballistic missile defense. They are the backbone of the United States surface fleet in every ocean on Earth. Every one of them, in her steel, in her systems, in her doctrine of independent action, is Burke. And not one sailor on any of those ships can tell you, without looking it up, what happened at Cape St. George on November 25th, 1943. That is the erasure. That is how it works. The Navy honored Arleigh Burke so thoroughly that it consumed him. His name became a ship type. His doctrine became a specification. His fight with Rickover became an obscure footnote in submarine history. His refusal of a 4th term under Kennedy became a sentence in a paperback biography that almost nobody has read. The Presidential Unit Citation of Destroyer Squadron 23 hangs in a museum. The name Little Beavers is a fraternal organization of old men, most of them now dead. This is not about Arleigh Burke. This is about what large institutions do to the men who save them. The United States Navy survived 1942 because junior and middle grade officers like Burke refused to fight by a doctrine that was killing their men. The United States Navy survived the Cold War because senior officers like Burke refused to let nuclear propulsion consume the balanced fleet. The United States Navy survived the transition to civilian analytical control because Burke, and officers like him, ran out the last of the old chain of command honestly before the office of Chief of Naval Operations was reduced to an advisory one. The Navy owes its survival to Burke. The Navy's repayment was to file him under a Hull designation. A cautious admiral who fights the doctrine in 1943 should be praised for saving lives. Instead, he is erased by the cartoon of the nickname. A Chief of Naval Operations who builds the submarine deterrent should be remembered for winning the Cold War. Instead, he is a 3-word phrase: Burke-class destroyer, that active duty sailors use without ever connecting to a man. The officer who followed the institution was punished. The institution he saved has forgotten he saved it. Sound familiar? It should. It is not a Navy problem. It is an institutional problem. Every large organization metabolizes the people who made it great by turning them into slogans, insignia, and naming conventions. The loyalty flows one way. The sea does not forgive. Neither does the Navy, and neither does history. If this changed how you see American naval history, subscribe. I cover the admirals your history teacher skipped, and I will show you why the Navy wanted it that way.